Okay, here we are. Good morning, everyone, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world. My name is Enherad Lang. I'm the Executive Director of PHAP, which is short for the International Association of Professionals in Humanitarian Assistance and Protection. And it is my honor to be your host for this live discussion event today. As you all know, today's event is in support of the World Humanitarian Summit process and specifically the Pacific Regional Consultation. This is in anticipation of the regional meeting for the Pacific, which will take place in Auckland from June 30th through July 2nd, so coming up in just a few weeks. And I should also mention that this live discussion is designed to be complementary to the ongoing text-based asynchronous online consultation, which has been running starting from the 11th of May and will close tomorrow. So I want to make sure to underline that following this discussion, if you wish to contribute more to the consultation process for the Pacific region, please do so today or tomorrow at the latest. The online consultation will be closing on Wednesday this week. Now, the purpose of today's event is really twofold. So first, it's to hear and explore the perspectives of a diverse and experienced group of panelists, whom I'll introduce in just a minute, who are involved in various ways in humanitarian or emergency disaster response in the Pacific region. And very importantly, secondly, to gather inputs from all of you who are participating today on key questions of concern in the consultation process for the region. I did also want to note that this session will be recorded. There were many people who wished to join who were not able to participate in real time during working hours, so we are recording this session to inspire them and offer them a framework also to input into the consultation process, and the recording will be available within a few hours after the event is completed, and we'll be sure to follow up by email with a notification to all of you in case you're aware of other people who may be interested in listening to it and contributing to the consultation process. So now I'll just run through a few quick technical points before getting into introducing our speakers. So I think many of you are familiar with the platform that we're using here, but in case this is your first time, I'll point out that throughout the event, of course, we very much encourage everybody to ask questions of our panelists, and the best way to do that is through the ask a question box in the lower right-hand corner of your screen. We also, of course, encourage you to continue actively engaging in the chat on the left-hand side, but for specific questions, it's preferable for those to go through the Ask a Question box for ease of sorting and organizing on our side. I'll also mention that we have instant polling often throughout the event. So depending on the direction of the discussion, you may see appearing in the middle bottom part of your screen, as we had during the opening of the event, a poll. It could be a multiple choice poll or an open response free text poll. And of course, when you see something appear there, and here my colleague Marcus is putting up another one for us to see here. When you see a poll appear here, you can just choose the option and that is automatically registered, and then you can also see the results live as they come in. So when we have questions coming up on which it would be interesting to take the pulse of the virtual room, we'll be doing that via a live poll, as you see now at the bottom of your screen. Oh, and I see actually that for the majority of you, this is your first time, so I'm not wasting time with these quick technical points at the beginning. So just two more points, and we will have, or we do currently have, a live Twitter feed running with the help of our colleague Pedro. So you can follow PHAP Forum and use the hashtag ReshapeAid. And finally, in case of connection problems, which do sometimes occur with any platform, we have set up a backup option for you in case you encounter connection problems. You can go to this separate link that you see on your screen, phap.org/WHS-Pacific/watch. This will take you to a YouTube powered live stream of the session, but do note that if you're using the backup option, that is a view-only option. You won't have the interactive capabilities of the actual platform. Okay, so we're going to move into introducing our panel. We have a very exciting panel in front of us today. Very glad to have all of you with us. I'll begin with Louise. Louise is a member of PHAP. We're very happy to have her working with us again. Louise is the director of Humanitarian Advisory Group, which is a Melbourne-based social enterprise providing research and advisory services on humanitarian issues, particularly in the Asia-Pacific region. Louise is a registered comprehensive nurse and specialized in emergency medicine, public health, and the health of refugees and asylum seekers. And also important to note that Louise was part of the writing team that produced the Minimum Interagency Standards for Protection Mainstreaming, which came out in 2012, and also co-authored a series of articles on the usefulness of standards for protection mainstreaming and community perceptions of protection. She also has wide-ranging field experience as an advisor on humanitarian protection issues in a number of different countries throughout East Africa, Asia, and also in Haiti. We're also very glad to welcome today Alan Ryan. Alan is the Executive Director of the Australian Civil Military Centre. Prior to this appointment, in 2011, he was the Principal of the Centre for Defence and Strategic Studies at the Australian Defence College and was previously the Senior Advisor to the Minister for Defence, in which role he was responsible for advising the Minister on intelligence, operations, strategic and international issues. And he has also worked as a consultant, providing consultancy services on strategy, security, crisis management to a variety of clients, including Australian government departments, the United States Joint Chiefs of Staff, and the Department for Peacekeeping Operations in the UN. I won't go into all of the details also of his research and academic career, but just to note that it is extensive, and again, very warmly welcome Alan to our panel. Next, I'd like to introduce and warmly welcome Simon Lambert. Simon is a researcher at Lincoln University in New Zealand, where he has lectured on Maori environmental management since 2010. His last research has focused in particular on the impacts of the 2010-2011 earthquakes in Christchurch on Maori in the city, and included recording and analyzing the experiences of Maori mental health community in the post-disaster landscape. He's currently collaborating on a follow-up project investigating how Indigenous knowledge can help Indigenous communities with disaster risk reduction, including climate change adaptation. Simon is also a tribal member of 2 Maori tribes. Next, I'd like to introduce and welcome Chris Piper. Chris has over 35 years of experience in community development and overseas aid from Asia, Africa, Europe, Australia, and the Pacific region. Since 1992, he has run his own consultancy called Torque Aid, which focuses on project management, humanitarian work, disaster risk management, community development, accredited training and research, as well as educational resources. And most recently, Chris was on a 6-month posting to Tonga as a disaster risk management specialist. And then last but not least, I'd like to welcome and introduce Finau Limuloa, who's connecting today from Fiji. Since 2012, Finau has been the Humanitarian Diplomacy and Disaster Law Delegate at the International Red Cross and Red Crescent Society's Pacific Regional Office based in Suva. Her work is based in the Pacific region and providing support to governments in strengthening their disaster-related legal frameworks in order to regulate the flow of international assistance into a country during a disaster, and also with regard to disaster risk reduction legislation and policy. Most recently, she was deployed to Vanuatu to support the government in the wake of Tropical Cyclone Pam, and previously has worked for the MFA in Tonga, as well as in the legal field in both Tonga and New Zealand. So a very warm welcome to all of you, and thank you for being a part of this. I know that Alan and Ryan have also both been active discussion moderators on the World Humanitarian Summit Pacific Discussion Forum, which I mentioned a few minutes ago and which is closing on Wednesday this week. So I'm sure that they would both also very much encourage everyone in the virtual room today to chime in and provide their 2 cents in that forum as well. So we're going to get into the first portion of our event today, which is a panel discussion where we're going to go around the virtual room amongst our 5 panelists in 3 rounds, asking 3 questions at different levels. So I'm going to start with, well, the big one. If you had to pick just one, what would you see as the most important challenge in meeting humanitarian needs in the Pacific region? And for all 3 of these questions, I think for the ease of everybody's mind and organization, we'll simply go through the panelists in the order in which I presented them. So we'll begin with Louise for this first question. Over to you, Louise.
Lovely. Good morning, everyone. The main challenges, most important challenges in meeting humanitarian needs in the Pacific, I think one of the most important challenges is really the agility of the international system to address people's needs in a holistic way. We tend to compartmentalize issues because of agency mandates at a global level which don't necessarily make sense at a local level. And I think in many ways the system itself actually creates the problem. So we have the humanitarian development divide, we have disaster risk reduction, disaster risk management versus emergency preparedness, trying to respond to migration and displacement differently when they're inherently connected. And I think as well as that, there's a lot of enthusiasm about, I guess, the so-called new players such as militaries and private sector engaging in humanitarian response. But I think the enthusiasm is perhaps not yet matched by a conversation about principles and accountability. And Humanitarian Advisory Group's been doing a little bit of research around private sector engagement in humanitarian response in the Pacific, and there are, I guess, some assumptions about effectiveness and agility and the speed with which private actors are responding without parallel analysis of results. Did those most in need receive the required information, protection and assistance? How were aid recipients selected? What about age, gender and diversity analysis? Were appropriate needs assessments undertaken? Coordination with other actors? All things that I think non-governmental actors have been grappling with how to do well for a very long time. On the other hand, do we really want to impose a whole set of procedures and processes that might stifle local spontaneity, agility, and possibly even innovation? And I guess I don't think we have the right balance yet. But I think we need to ensure that we don't lose some of the fundamental elements of what makes emergency assistance humanitarian. So that's some of my thinking around the systemic challenges in meeting needs in the Pacific.
Fantastic. Thank you, Louise. So we'll turn now to Alan. Alan, if you had to pick one, what do you see as the most important challenge in meeting humanitarian needs in the region?
Well, I had a very good response prepared, and I must say, having heard Louise, I completely endorse what she said, but I've basically had something of a bet each way. I'd argue that we need, very much along the lines that Louise was arguing, a more effective humanitarian system to ensure timely coordinated responses to the disasters that arise. I'd certainly endorse the point that Louise made about the humanitarian development divide. And my point would be that disaster preparedness, risk reduction, social protection, all issues that are often in short supply across the Pacific are needed to help build the resilience of countries and communities. And I do believe that we need to do more in terms of investing up front rather than simply focusing, as we so often do, on post-disaster recovery. That being said, if I was looking for the low-hanging fruit, or even better, something that could make an enormous difference and could make an enormous difference now, it would be to effectively address gender and protection needs in disaster preparedness and response. We continue throughout the region to see women occupy marginal roles in their own countries and communities. And a point that we will make very often in our work, that in doing so, we're effectively denying ourselves access to 50% of the available talent pool. There are unique needs, gender needs and protection needs of Pacific nations, and these, I think, need to be factored into every disaster response from the outset. And honestly, I don't believe we're doing that at the moment. We need to do a great deal more to increase the inclusion of women in decision-making for disaster planning, response and recovery, and I think that that's got the potential to do a great deal in terms of improving the situation in the region. Certainly, gender issues, protection issues need to be factored into disaster preparedness training. It's something that we've made something of a start on, but I think there's an awful long way to go with that. And certainly one of the things that we're doing is working on exercises that will expose a much wider range of responders to the importance of planning and addressing gender as a core component of disaster response. So I've had a bit of a bet both ways, but obviously identifying the macro issue of a stronger humanitarian system, but at the same time, I think there's something that we can do now that will make a very big difference to the challenges that we face in the Pacific in particular, and that's dealing more effectively with gender issues. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much for that. We'll turn now to Simon. We're just unmuting your mic. There you are.
Hi, yes. Look, and Louise and Alan have framed it very nicely and comprehensively there. I'll draw specifically on the forum that I was moderating, which was on the topic of traditional knowledge, and draw attention to the vast amount of traditional knowledge held across the Pacific in and around environmental hazards and the local coping strategies that have been fairly finely honed over many, many generations, and which are now somewhat in danger of being marginalised and isolated. We've certainly seen that in New Zealand with some of the indigenous knowledge that Māori have around geological activity, and we now I guess are really struggling to retain and build on that, and I see that danger all the way across the Pacific. Alan mentioned gender, very important, and there are quite specific gender roles that communities have in such areas as environmental management, hazard protection and so on. And overall, I think for the region, the challenge is actually to reframe what we too often see as a vulnerability to hazards, and start seeing at the resilience that is inherent in our communities. Now, I'd leave it at that.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. And next, we're turning to, do we have Chris on the line?
Yes, you do. Good morning, everybody, or good evening, whatever. Look, I've just come back. I've just been working for 6 months, as was mentioned, as the Disaster Risk Management Advisor for the Kingdom of Tonga for their National Emergency Management Organisation. So I was there, so it was a DFAT funded position. I'm a member of the Australian Civilian Corps, and we had a number of us, 5 around the Pacific. One of my colleagues drew the short straw being in Vanuatu, so he's been flat out since that time. The point I really wanted to make here, and I think it's an important point, not just for the Pacific, but I think for many parts of the world, but you see it particularly in the Pacific, is that we seem to operate a dualist, a parallel system of disaster risk management or emergency management. There are really sort of 2 systems running in parallel. Most of the Pacific Island countries and PNG as well, their actual emergency management is based on on an Australian New Zealand model, which has a legal framework, a national act. There's a national emergency management plan. There are national emergency management committees which meet there. So it's basically the model which is used in New Zealand and Australia, and pretty effectively overall, I think, when you look at the Christchurch earthquake or the Queensland floods in 2011 or the bushfires in Victoria, where I live, in 2009. It's not perfect, but it's a pretty robust system. And it's actually based on this risk management framework, which was the old Australian-New Zealand framework 4360, which is adapted for the Pacific, and then is now part of this international ISO 31000 risk management framework. So that's the system which is basically used in Tonga and most of the other Pacific countries, based on that system. But then together we then have a sort of a parallel system where we have many some great ideas coming through from the international community, particularly some of the UN agencies, some of the larger international organizations. So, for example, my main task in Tonga was to actually look at embedding the cluster coordination system, which really is a sort of an OCHA. They've been sort of the champion of it for the last 20 plus years, to actually embed that within the National Emergency Management Framework. But it's a different system, and I think, so there's really 2 parallel systems. And when I speak to some of the UN people, when I speak to some NGO people, and I talk about, well, this needs to go into the National Emergency Management Framework, and this is, the risk, the ISO 31000, there's sometimes a blank look on people's faces, and I think that's unfortunate. And really what we were trying to do in Tonga was to actually develop this, in fact, a ministry-led, so we really wanted it led by the Tongan ministries, that the cluster system, but supported strongly by the Pacific Humanitarian Team, which is based primarily out of Fiji, in a way of actually bringing together those 2 systems, where they would look at not only, in fact, both disaster risk reduction and emergency response and recovery initiatives. And the practical application of that is, of course, now that we have information that the El Nino, phenomena is developing. If the cluster system was working properly, then those clusters already now would be working from, the health cluster or the food and security livelihoods cluster would already be working to do some disaster risk reduction initiatives through that cluster system, to prepare for the drought which is coming. So it's really this trying to get the 2 systems working a bit better together.
Great, thank you. It's very interesting. And I see a couple of our participants, other participants are contributing responses as well to the same question, and I'd certainly encourage anyone else to chime in there as well in the text box. So we're now turning to Finau. I understand that we may have a connection problem, so we're just going to test that out. How is that? Let's see, are you there, Finau?
Yes, Malolele Bulabinaka. Can you hear me? Yep.
Yes, we hear you loud and clear.
Okay, fantastic. Those responses from the previous panelists were excellent, and I completely endorse everything that's been said. If I did have to pick just one issue as what I see as the biggest humanitarian challenge, it would probably have to be along the lines of what Louise mentioned about the development divide. So what we come across on a daily basis in our work across the Pacific, particularly with Red Cross societies and also with civil society, is that the way that the model of resourcing for humanitarian needs is often tied to, so donor funding is often tied to donor priorities, which may be a fantastic project or a fantastic priority, but it's not aligned with what the particular country or organisation may see as its most prominent humanitarian need. And what you often find is organisations then trying to adapt because they need money in order to run their activities and their programs and their capacity building. So they kind of skew it and try and undertake the activity where the funding is and integrate elements of what their actual priority is, so you don't get that full capacity building in the area that they actually need, because it has to be always skewed towards wherever the funding is. And that really is a huge challenge towards building the resilience of Pacific countries, and it actually inhibits it. So for me, and what I come across on a day-to-day basis, that would probably be it.
Okay, great. Thanks to all of you. So we'll now be going around one more time, well, actually two more times, so with two more questions. But before we do, I just want to highlight a few of the responses, just to sum up what we gathered. So there was a strong emphasis on, as several people mentioned, the humanitarian development divide. Also, several mentions of the challenge of gender and protection needs, echoed by several panelists. A couple of strong points regarding effectiveness, and really looking at the effectiveness. The word agility was used of different actors in the humanitarian disaster response and related spaces. Also from Simon, I think a really valuable point regarding traditional knowledge, the vast amounts of traditional knowledge that are out there. And then the interesting perspective of Chris, really drawing from his work and looking at the relationships between systems for dealing with risk management and related challenges at the national, the regional and global levels, and the relationships among them. So thanks very much to all of you. It was a really interesting first round and a great framing of the priorities in terms of challenges in the region. So moving to our second question, and I guess drawing a bit from where Chris left us at the end of his comments, what is the most important change that you would see needs to be made on the global level in order to meet the challenges in the Pacific region? So again, we'll start at the top with Louise and then go through the list. So over to you, Louise.
Great, thank you. Well, I think on that theme around the system, globally, I don't think international actors really have any insight into the radical changes that are needed to make the humanitarian system locally responsive. We have a lot of rhetoric around local ownership and reasonable investments in local capacity building and building disaster resilience, but when it comes to large-scale disasters, international actors still come in and take over. They bring their funding, they bring their processes, their templates and forms, their English, their coordination structures, on top of national existing coordination structures that may exist, and their policies by and large dictated from headquarters. And one example that I was alerted to recently, it's from some forthcoming research by Australian NGOs regarding the response to Tropical Cyclone Pam. They cited an example of the automatic assumption that the Humanitarian Action Plan would follow the flash appeal, and it raised some interesting questions. told the Disability Desk at the Ministry of Justice had a project they wanted support for, but they were ineligible as a government agency. National NGOs were not easily incorporated as they're not in the system as an appealing agency. They could have been approved, but approval was required in Geneva and couldn't occur within the timeframes that have been set. And so I think you know, there's some real kind of soul searching that needs to happen amongst the large agencies about what it would actually take to flip the system on its head. And as Chris mentioned, we do have some ideas about what international assistance in an emergency response can look like when it is fully under the management and control of local authorities. And I'm thinking here of responses in Japan and Christchurch. Now, obviously, these are very different circumstances, but I think there must be something in that we can learn from. And also understand or try to find out what some examples there are of rapid scale up that doesn't subsume local systems and structures. So I'm not sure that I have the answer as to what the change is, but I don't think we're quite there in terms of really understanding how different things would have to be in order to actually meet local challenges.
All right, thank you, Louise. And moving to Alan, your views on what change is needed at the global level.
Well, once again, I'd completely endorse Louise's comments. The Pacific region is unique in its geography, its cultures, and the humanitarian challenges that we face in the region. And certainly the international humanitarian community needs to take these factors into account in responding to crises in the region. One of the problems we face when engaging at a global level, I think, is that there's a certain distorting effect of the sheer numbers and the problems that are faced, particularly in places in Africa and the like, and not to downplay the significance of the problems that they face, but on a person-for-person basis, there are significant issues within our region. So the international humanitarian community needs to be aware of the existing structures, the organisations, the governing frameworks that exist within the Pacific, and be prepared to work with and through these structures to come up with the most effective outcomes.
All right, excellent, thank you. And Simon.
Yes, look, I mean, we best find something we disagree on somewhere along the line. In the interest of robust debate, I agree again. With my colleagues here. What I've just scribbled down is disaggregation. I was at and following on from what Ellen's just been saying, I was at a UN conference in Geneva on it was a Hyogo Framework for Action. So this was a couple of years ago. And sitting in on a number of workshops and sessions, and mainly observing, I gave a presentation on a session on Indigenous knowledge. And you know, we had representatives from quite a few Pacific Islands, but quite often they were lumped in the Asia Pacific region, and so there would be representatives from you know, China, and you know, the US, and of course Australia and New Zealand. You know, we always hop in there, and some of the comments in those sessions, and also more importantly over cups of tea and coffee afterwards, that they were very, very dissatisfied with continually being in these you know, these forums where you were you know, representing a nation of some tens of thousands, and there were people there representing tens, hundreds of millions, and your concerns and issues were just lost in just the demographics and logistics of it. And I have to say, New Zealanders are also very ignorant of the Pacific Islands. We jump on a plane at Auckland, and we're out at Suva or somewhere. The scale at which humanitarian action has to operate across the Pacific is truly astounding, and I don't think many people around the world actually get the size of it and how complicating that is. But I know with climate change and sea level rise, clearly significant issues in the Pacific Islands. And what we see now is almost an acceptance at the highest levels around the world that yes, climate is changing. There will be some pretty important impacts from that to address. And what we will do now is adapt to climate change and sea level rise. Now, sea level rise may lead to to be pretty blunt about it, the eradication of some of our Pacific neighbours. And this is, quite a horrific thing to actually almost just let it glide by and say, okay, we'll adapt. And a part of that adaptation may be Australia and New Zealand taking in more migrants. And of course, they've been calling for action on this for many, many years. They were some of the first communities to organise. So yes, so I have this word disaggregation there. How do we actually get Pacific Island states a voice in those discussions where they can have their really serious concerns addressed in a much more meaningful manner.
And moving now to Chris, we've had a very agreeable panel so far. We'll see if we have anything anything edgy or otherwise coming from Chris. Over to you.
Okay, this is a slight change of tack. I think something which Alan mentioned, it complemented what I'm about to say. I think one of the major challenges globally for the humanitarian community is how we deal with these huge complex emergencies. And for example, looking at Syria, where the whole situation is just appalling on that, and particularly I think from a humanitarian perspective, because we have this new core humanitarian standard which has now been introduced the last 6 or 8 months or so, with its 9 principles based on the Sphere program and the Red Cross Code of Conduct and some of the earlier standards which it's incorporated. And to be honest, for the humanitarian community, we really need to wrestle through with this new core humanitarian standard in how this works throughout Syria and the surrounding region, and it's not working. We can't get it right there. We can't get it right anywhere else. And I think that is a sort of a credibility point for the humanitarian community. And I think that globally, I think that's a big challenge. It probably has less relevance, I suppose, to the Pacific, because we're not likely to have a complex emergency, certainly in the Pacific, of that sort of scale. But I think that this is a question of, it's a question of, where we go as a humanitarian community, to be honest.
No, absolutely. And now to Finau. We're just unmuting your mic and.
Thank you. Yep. Okay. Yeah. So the report that Louise mentioned by the NGOs that was done in the wake of TCPAM, I contributed quite a bit to that report, having just come from there myself, and it's probably not very technical or academic to say so, but I think the whole attitude with the way that international humanitarian assistance is delivered needs to change. And what we saw in Vanuatu was international actors flowing in from all over the place. We had Finland, Denmark, Norway, and a lot of them had never even heard of Vanuatu before and come in with their systems. And I think the whole attitude to me as a lawyer, and I guess as a Pacific Islander, is you're still coming in, yes, to a disaster-affected country, but to a sovereign state that has mechanisms in place, that has coordination structures in place. And the idea is not to circumvent them, but to come under them and strengthen them and fill in the gaps where there are gaps. And I think there's a tendency to think that I'm coming in with all the answers. This worked fantastic the last place I was at, and this is what we're going to do now. And so, for me, it was deeper. It was just the whole attitude with which people came in, the way that people engaged with local officials and authorities was quite disrespectful in some ways, and it just hampered the disaster response and just created more little mini disasters when we're already dealing with a big one. So I think there's a lot that can be done, I guess, in educating international actors in the way that they should approach a response, particularly in a country if they've never heard of it before.
Great, thank you. So on this question, it really seems we really have a unified voice and a major thread going through all of our panelists' remarks, beginning with Louise referring to the lack of awareness at the global level, the need to do some soul searching, Alan's point regarding this distorting effect of the numbers, Simon echoing that, and then adding to the point of the distorting effect of the numbers, also looking at the fact that the scale is truly astounding, and really noting that at the global level, people simply don't get it, they don't understand the scale of the region. And then also Finau echoing the same thread, using the terms attitude, education, so I think all very much along the same line. And then Chris making, I think, an interesting complementary point as well, that there are systems sort of in question being developed, standards at the global level that do affect what's taking place at the national level, and that those well, simply need to be sorted out, I think, with that voice of national actors having a stronger place. So moving to the third question, we're looking at what needs to change on the regional level now to ensure that humanitarian needs are met. And going through again, we'll begin with Louise and then go through the list. So back to you, Louise.
Great, thank you. I think we need to look at what structures exist at the regional level that could be further leveraged to provide leadership and coordination. The Pacific Islands Forum comes to mind, and I'm sure there are many others that have probably stronger connections than I that have ideas about that as well. But we do have some good examples from other regions, and I'm thinking of the AHA Centre in Jakarta coordinating humanitarian response within ASEAN. I also think, the headquarters of large agencies need to recognise the unique nature of the Pacific and resource or keep resourcing Pacific-based teams rather than having them based in combined Asia-Pacific offices. And I think, this is possibly a little bit broader than the regional level question, but just touching on some of the things that Finau raised around understanding culture and I guess the importance of community and ways of doing things. And I'm starting to write a bit of a paper around the myth of cultural sensitivity, because I think the regionally and internationally we need to really better understand our cross-cultural engagement. I trained as a nurse in New Zealand in the early 1990s, and a very prominent kind of way of thinking was actually more along the lines of cultural safety, that actually when two people from different cultures interact, they bring with them their own heritage, their own ancestry, their own, which then informs the way in which they view the world, interact with it, learn, and make decisions. And so when you have people coming together, you are it's both sides coming together. I think the problem of the way in which humanitarian and development actors look at cultural sensitivity is we tend to get a tiny bit of information about different cultures and then work off stereotypes and then wonder why it doesn't work. So I think there's a lot of work to do around there, but I think, again, looking at what structures exist at the regional level and trying to invest more in those. And then I think also just trying to understand better the relationship between Pacific Island nations and the two big donors in the region, Australia and New Zealand, and the reliance I think that many nations have on these countries for income, whether that be through overseas official development assistance, or whether it's recognition of the tourism dollar, the fact that many family and friends are based in Australia and New Zealand, and how does that actually influence and perhaps constrain the ability of Pacific nations and Pacific organisations to have that voice that Simon was talking about. So I think there are some significant changes that need to happen. Some of them are institutional, but many of them are actually about attitude and understanding as well.
Great, thank you, Louise. And moving to Alan. Sorry, Alan, just one moment. We're unmuting you. There you go.
Great, I've got my microphone up and running. Look, I think Louise is spot on there. I'm going to take a slightly different approach simply because I don't want to reiterate, I think, a very good point. But I'd like to emphasise the role that regional organisations can play. I think we've done very well in terms of regional organisations supporting the development of frameworks in terms of disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation. Obviously, there's a great deal more to do. There's a lot that's done in terms of providing technical experts. I'd like to see the next step perhaps being that regional organisations play a greater role in negotiating and implementing regional disaster response frameworks. And I also think there's probably a greater role for regional organisations in supporting affected nations, taking on board the comments that have been made about the specific needs of different countries spread across the region in terms of coordinating and managing support provided by other nations within the region and by the international community more broadly. I certainly take the point that Simon's made in the chat that's going on in the margins of this. We certainly don't want to see dare I say, quote, the old colonial nations swanning in. This is about promoting regional ownership and giving the nations that are most in need of assistance a stronger voice.
Right. And moving now to Simon. And thanks, Simon, for your active participation in the chat, and also to Fino. We certainly appreciate that.
Yes, I'm furiously trying to multitask here, and it's a lot of fun. I have to say, really enjoying this. We have had this chat here on the cultural nuances, and I've just put up there. We've also observed that in New Zealand, time and time again, and just looking at the disaster response and the often the marginalisation of traditional Māori institutions, the marae, the whānau, and so on, in the risk and response phases, but also, of course, their isolation from the preparedness, the readiness reduction phases, which what we see and what I found in my research is our communities are continually responding and recovering to disasters and trying to prepare for the next disaster. But again, the way these things are framed, we do not necessarily interpret the environment as hazardous. So even the terminology for the land, this is, for us, this is Papatuanuku, this is the Earth Mother. Tangaroa is one of the great gods of the sea. These disasters are recurring. They are a part of living in that environment. So, it's I wouldn't say so much a subtle distinction, but you live in your environment. Your environment is what it is, and it's personified, it's mythologized, it's the foundation of your existence as a community. Now, we actually have, of course, all sorts of other thoughts and beliefs now. Christianity is very strong across the Pacific, and the Pacific churches were very prominent in the support for their communities in Christchurch, and also communities in Samoa after the tsunami. So I can't remember the year, but it wasn't that long ago. So we have, these communities really having to respond and recover to a succession of let's continue to call them disasters. And quite frankly, they're often overwhelmed. So to try and prepare now for sea level rise and climate changes, when the most powerful economies in the world are, shall we say, still somewhat sitting on the fence in their response and interpretation of the science. So I think the cultural nuances across the Pacific are really, really fundamental, and I can't go on about them enough. When you are working with other peoples, they have systems, they have hierarchies, they have gender roles. And one thing I'd like to pick up on, it was in one of the Pacifica reports leading up to this, the role of youth. I know with Māori communities, so many of our people now are under the age of 30, although the fertility rates are declining. If you aren't reaching out and including your youth in everything, then you will not have success 5-10 years down the line, even quicker. So in some way, encouraging and supporting our youth who have got all this passion, they have, I'm getting on a bit now, and it's so easy to get jaded about environmental movements, about all these things where once we used to march in the streets, and yet young people still have that passion. They still want to make a difference. And all across the Pacific, our communities have wonderful young people, and they've got to fully be a part of that. And I think that needs to be structured in, and I think there could be real benefits in building in formally at all levels a youth for voice. I've gone off on a bit of a tangent there, but there's so many things going on in this discussion. I'll stop there.
Oh, that's great, thank you, and thanks for multitasking and for the inspiring note that you gave us. Moving now to Chris. Chris, over to you.
Okay, I'd just like to mention a couple of things. One is I want to mention some positive things to do with sort of disaster trends. It's almost an oxymoron in some senses. And then talk a bit about some, when we talk about figures, to talk a bit about climate change as well. I think that we sometimes undersell ourselves on the successes which we do have, and so both in the Hyoga framework for action and the sort of lead up to Sendai, I felt really we actually underplayed some of the success stories which have happened over the last 10 or 15 years, particularly I think in disaster risk reduction. Now the key figures which I look at, and we actually graph them out, are from the Red Cross, the annual World Disasters Report, which is fantastic. And so this is done by this research agency in Belgium, and I think that it's, most people, so anyway, the statistics there are well crafted, and that shows over the last 10 years, for example, that the numbers of disasters have actually declined as a total. Even when you separate the technological disasters from the natural disasters, that the natural disasters also have been, in fact, declining slightly. When there's a mega disaster, of course, we get sometimes huge numbers of people killed. For example, the Haiti earthquake. But I think the last couple of years, the numbers have been quite low, relatively low. The number of people affected, it did peak, I think, in 2011, but last year, I think, was the lowest ever it reported for numbers of people affected by disasters. And obviously it depends a bit on the damage caused, whether it's in a developed country or an emerging country. That tends to go up and down. So what a general thing is, though, there have been some great, some improvements, and I think that's due to disaster risk reduction across the board, and I think we do undersell ourselves on that, and I think we need to say there's been some good things happening. What the World Disasters Report doesn't report on, what the figures don't include, are two things really, which are a bit concerning. One is when you look at the statistics, for example, in the drought in 2010 to 2012 in East Africa, it doesn't actually include the deaths, the 260,000 deaths from the famine in Somalia. So that there's nothing there, it's a complete blank, and I think that is unfortunate. and therefore that needs to be recognised more. And it doesn't actually include the number of people either who die or are affected by climate change. Now, the best thing I read was back in 2009. It was the Human Impact Report, Climate Change and the Anatomy of a Silent Crisis. It was the one which Kofi Annan chaired, I think, that organisation, the Global Humanitarian Forum in Geneva, but it closed down after that. And that was probably the best attempt I've seen at trying to put a figure to people affected by climate change. Again, I think it could be people could criticise those figures, and that's a fair enough point. It would be good, I think it would be ideal if those sort of figures could be included, for example, incorporated or attempted in, for example, the World Disaster Report, because then I think that will sort of flesh out and the World Disaster Report to include, obviously, this important area of climate change and how it affects people. I realise it's very difficult to measure. But that is, at the moment, it's obviously an omission. It's not included in the annual report from the Red Cross.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and a good concrete recommendation, a suggestion that. We're moving now to Finau. Before we do, I'd just like to make a note or recap for everyone that we are actually going to be producing a report from this event. So we'll be feeding that into the formal summit consultation process, and therefore all of the very valuable inputs that we're getting in text form. So the themes that are coming up in the chat, and there are many threads ongoing there. Also the text-based responses to the free text poll questions or free response questions that are on the screen, as well as the Q&A. That will all be brought together and sorted out into all of these threads for some coherence in the report. So please do keep all of those inputs coming from all fronts. So now moving to Finau.
Yes, thank you. Really interesting hearing what everyone's been saying, and really great answers and recommendations. What I would say would probably, just to add, is what I would encourage more of on a regional level, and this kind of goes back to what Alan said about regional organisations, is the encouragement of more peer-to-peer support and exchanges between countries or between civil society organisations. So, for example, if Chris has been working in Tonga for the last 6 months with NEMO, the National Emergency Management Office, then how about that expertise in Tonga being offered? Maybe the NDMO can go and sit with the NDMO in Micronesia, or somewhere where they kind of need some kind of support. Because I think that's really valuable. We've got the old cultural, traditional relationships with each other, and I think that just really adds when you bring in technical talent, and it really enhances relationships and strengthens relationships and ties between Pacific countries. I know that when there's a disaster, Pacific countries want to respond, and I think this would be a way for them too. So a practical example, when we were sitting here in the wake of TCPAN, we needed a communications person on the ground, and we have capacity here with the local staff in Fiji. Unfortunately, planes weren't flying yet, and only the military planes from either Australia or New Zealand flying. But we had to get a communications person from Finland because our local have a visa to get to New Zealand, to be able to get on that plane, or a visa to get to Australia to be able to get on that plane. And so we weren't able to have those, country, regional responses as much as we would have liked to. And I think if we can look at creative ways, if there is a disaster and we do need a logistics person, there is capacity within the region, but we draw on that capacity to be able to meet humanitarian needs because they have the background, they have cultural awareness, and then where there are gaps, then we can invite our international friends to come in and fill the gaps relook at the structure of the humanitarian response in the region, I think it'll be a good start.
Excellent, thank you. So we're now going to move to looking at a few questions that have come in from participants during the event. So I'm going to, they're quite different in their scope and level of specificity and theme, but I think what I'll do is just pose 3 questions, and then I'll go around the panel and invite each of our 5 panelists to take up 1, 2, or all 3 of the questions, depending on their preference. So the first one is, what is the role of the Pacific diaspora in Australia and New Zealand in terms of supporting humanitarian response in the region? That's a question from Megan. Then a second question, this is from Stacy. How can we strengthen women's resilience and effectively use their capacities in pre, during, and post-disaster contexts in the Pacific? And then a third question, looking specifically at cash-based approaches. Are cash-based approaches a recommended strategy of disaster relief in the region, given the fact that most small island states are relatively isolated? So three very different questions. I'll go through again in order, and again, please feel free to take up 1, 2, or all 3 of the questions according to your preference, starting first with Louise.
Can you just repeat the second question around strengthening resilience?
Sure, of course. That was, how can we strengthen women's resilience and effectively use their capacities in pre, during, and post-disaster?
Great, thank you. Look, I think one of the challenges of dealing with gender and protection issues in an emergency is that these are very deeply ingrained habits, and you know, and so I would say that we need to have much greater attention to issues of gender analysis in our development programming, because it's very difficult in the early stages of a rapid onset emergency to suddenly try and look at issues around gender equality. Not saying that you can't do that, but I think it's very challenging to make significant changes if it's not ingrained in development programming. So I think that also speaks to the humanitarian development divide of saying, look, if we need a response that's going to you know, meet the needs of women, but also see women as decision makers, and you know, having that kind of leadership and resilience at the emergency level, then it has to be embedded. Yeah.
Great, thank you. And then Alan, moving over to you. And apologies if I was too quick in reading the questions. Do let me know if you'd like me to repeat any of them. Marcus has also typed them in the chat on the left.
Thank you, Ingrid. The 3 questions, I'll focus on the second one because I was the first person to bring it up. But certainly that issue of what is the role of the Pacific diaspora, I think we do need to have a vision of a Pacific economy. I know it's a difficult thing in many ways to imagine given the scale and the scope of it, but with significant populations, particularly in Australia and New Zealand, there's obviously a factor for it, but it's something I think that an evidence-based approach, and perhaps we need to do more into the issue of the flow of monies within the region. In terms of the issue of how we can strengthen women's resilience, it is an incredibly problematic issue in every society, and I'm certainly not targeting Pacific communities. However, across the Pacific, there are significant issues that we face, and just to put it into some sort of context, women who experience physical or sexual violence range between 60 and 70%, and significant numbers of men consider that physical violence against women is acceptable. And that's just a problem, I think, of global dimensions as well as within the region. However, in the aftermath of disasters, we have strong statistical evidence that demonstrates that gender and sexual-based violence is exacerbated, and you see increases of up to 300% in reports of domestic violence. At the end of the day, it is about empowering women, and as Louise said, it's not something that can be left until a crisis occurs. Gender analysis needs to very much be a part of all organisational planning, and certainly this is something that we're doing at a governmental level in terms of our National Action Plan for Women, Peace and Security, and this extends into the area of humanitarian and disaster assistance. It's something that needs to be factored into the planning and training of our personnel, and again, this is something that we're starting to do more effectively, but there is a lot of work to be done. So we've actually put out a publication which I'd like to share. It's certainly available online, called Gendered Crises, Gendered Responses, and it's a start point for us in terms of making planners and responders, whether they're government or non-government, aware of the fact that they need to bring a gender perspective to bear when they find themselves particularly deployed into unfamiliar circumstances in different cultural contexts where women's vulnerability to male behaviour may be a factor.
Right, thank you. Now we're moving to Simon. Before I do, there's actually one more question I'm going to add to the list here with thanks to Alan. So Alan raised the question in the chat, is the cluster system working? So not a small question. If not, what more can be done to promote consultation and information sharing, not to say deconfliction? So I'll add that to the list for the rest of our speakers, and then Alan will circle back to you if you don't mind to get your views on that question. So now moving to Simon.
Thanks. I've scribbled down a few notes here. First, on the role of the Pacific diaspora, very important. What I've noted down here is that one of the causal factors in that strength would be the New Zealand and Australian employment situations for these communities. Also, I'd imagine the West Coast of America. We see Pacific Island and Māori unemployment being at very high levels still in New Zealand. I think from memory, probably up around at least 11, maybe 12, 13% unemployment amongst those communities. In various regions it's much worse, of course. The Pacific Island communities are mobile. They have followed the employment, as do many Māori communities now. The current migration patterns we're seeing in New Zealand are swinging in towards Southeast Asian and Chinese migrants, particularly students coming in. And also I've noted down here mechanisation. When Google invented the driverless car, yes, I dare say it has a number of flaws still, but it'll be a work in progress. And I think we have tens of thousands of jobs in New Zealand under threat, jobs that have for the last 30, 40 years been a mainstay in Pacific Island communities, so factory jobs, driving, labouring jobs and so on. Not great jobs, and certainly the next generation better educated and pushed through by their parents into better employment options. But as far as remittances go, if this is a resource for the Pacific, then I think it's at risk from some of those factors that I've just mentioned. Just a quick note on, and some really good comments already said on the capacity, the obvious need for women to have capacity to engage properly in humanitarian action, as is their right. for Māori communities, we saw gender inequity coming in with the Victorian English, bless them. So this is going back 2 centuries now. Our men, you know, you see a way where suddenly there's a hierarchy and you can be up it. It was taken. But the key gatekeepers in our communities are the aunties, women in their 50s and 60s. They know everyone, they know everything that needs to be done, and they have true power, true strength. And if you're not talking to a bunch of middle-aged to elderly women when you're working in this area, you're not talking to the proper people, and I think a lot of us would acknowledge that very quickly. I don't have a lot of insight into the other 2 questions there, sorry. Cash-based approaches, certainly no point giving out cash if there's nothing to spend it on, and the amount of inflation that you're going to draw into a community from the construction sector in Christchurch post-disaster, I think it was something like 30–40% inflation in building costs, really significant, very difficult for a lot of people. And the cluster system again, sorry, I won't add anything on that. It's not my area of expertise, and I'll pass on that one, thanks.
Not a problem, and thank you for your practical responses and perspective. And moving to Chris. Chris, you have the floor is open to you, and you have your choice of 1 or 4 or anywhere in between.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for that. I'd like to make comments on a couple of the questions raised. One relating to the diaspora, and one obviously relating to clusters, as I was involved in Tonga. With the diaspora, it was interesting in Tonga. I think the population in Tonga is about just over 100,000, and the diaspora spread throughout New Zealand, Australia, and mainly the west coast of the States. I think it's between 120 to 140,000. So it's a huge diaspora and a huge percentage on that. Obviously, in disasters, people will support their own families anyway. But more than that, the diaspora often wants to help. And in fact, we did discuss this as part of when we were looking at the clusters and when we were looking at responses to disasters. And one of the initiatives we felt we could help promote was that a trust fund, you know, ideally sort of supported by the King, would be opened up pretty quickly so that diaspora people could pay money into this trust fund, which could then be used by whoever. Rather than going the route where people send in gifts in kind, you know, send in clothes or whatever they think is needed. Of course, money is much better than gifts in kind. Interestingly enough, I want to make a comment on another diaspora which I've been involved in, which is in Melbourne. I'm part of there's a Syrian community, humanitarian community forum, which is really, it's a meeting place. We've generally met about once every 3 months, between the Syrian diaspora and the humanitarian community for ways in which they can support each other practically. And obviously this is for a complex emergency which is now in its 5th year, so it's not a natural disaster which will be over certainly in a few months on that. And there have been some really interesting practical initiatives coming out of that. So, for example, some of the Syrian diaspora here, you know, they're sending in medicines to people in Syria. This is a year ago, and we were able to get support from the Burnett Institute, who are the sort of the health, you know, specialists in this, who were able to recommend the WHO, you know, the right sort of kits to use. And some of the diaspora met with the Burnett people, and they were able to be cost effective in doing what they were doing. We've actually had a team of psychologists, in fact the psychologist team who helped support people in the bushfire, and they've actually offered to work with the Syrian diaspora because many of them are so stressed out supporting their compatriots. And that hasn't actually happened yet, but that has been flagged. In Britain, in fact, ODI, the Humanitarian Policy Group, in fact, brought out a publication, and later on I can pass this to Marcus, on the Syrian diasporas around the world. So it's a really interesting research. If somebody did some research, one of their researchers looked at the Syrian diasporas, how it operated in different countries. Just to say on the clusters, I mean, clusters is a form primarily of coordination, primarily, And it came back to my first point, is that there's two systems in the National Emergency Management Plan which already exists in Tonga. There is, of course, a coordination system. It's just not called clusters. And that's been the challenge. You know, clusters is very much a UN term. And therefore, in Tonga, we've worked carefully and we've worked hard with people to say that the cluster, there will be a system of clusters, which is really like coordination hubs, but they're very much headed up. They're headed up, two of them, in fact, by the National Emergency Management Organization, supported by the Red Cross, and 8 by host government ministries. And it's their job, it's their baby, basically. Now, they can be supported because there is a whole lot of really skilled support, particularly from the Pacific Humanitarian team, but it should be ministry-led, supported by the outside, by the Pacific Humanitarian team. And of course, clusters would look across the disaster risk management spectrum. So it needs to look, again, at disaster risk reduction. And I made the point earlier now, El Nino's coming in, so those clusters already should be working with communities to say, how can they prepare for the drought conditions coming in? And then obviously, you know, the emergency response. But similarly, equally importantly, the recovery side, which takes months, if not years. And Tonga got hit by Tropical Cyclone Ian in January 2014, and the emergency response, where the clusters were introduced for the first time, worked reasonably well, but everything sort of folded then. After that, there was no really, there was no coordination of the longer term, and in some senses more complex, recovery program, and that's where that needs to be ministry-led. And I guess in Vanuatu now, they're moving into their recovery stage, and that's why ideally, and I know that through the National Disaster Management Centre there, they will support that sort of cluster approach for ministries to take responsibility to carry through on their recovery programs, as happens in Australia and New Zealand. I mean, it's the model which happens in those two countries.
Great, thank you, Chris. And now moving to Finau. We'll just unmute you. There you are, you have the floor.
Thank you. With regard to Pacific diaspora, I think a really important way that they can contribute is the way that New Zealand Red Cross has done it is last year they set up a Pacific advisory group. Now, this advisory group, they're not members of the Red Cross, they're just leaders from the Pacific community. So they set up this group, and the idea of the group is to be a sounding board for New Zealand Red Cross when they run some of their programs in New Zealand, or if they, in the Pacific, or if they come into any problems or issues or difficulties while running their programs. This advisory group is a good way of being a sounding board and trying to brainstorm ways through these difficulties. And I found that really good, particularly for us in terms of disaster, because it works the other way around as well. In terms of messaging to our Pacific diaspora in New Zealand on what to send, rather than just send everything everyone wants to help, of course, during a disaster. But because this relationship has been established, it's quite it's straightforward for the New Zealand Red Cross to then contact these Pacific leaders that they already have an existing relationship with to go feedback into the communities. This is what the government's saying they need, this is what the Red Cross saying they need. And I found that quite effective. I don't know whether other organizations have Pacific advisory groups around the Pacific and also in Australia, New Zealand and elsewhere. But I do find so far it's been running really well, and it's been a great value for both sides, so both for the Pacific diaspora and also for our organization. With regards to the cluster system, I think so far it's been working great, and I think it's great because it is led by government, and there are national leads, and I think the way that it tips over sometimes is when the response becomes too big for national capacity, and you need to get international assistance in. And I think maybe we can kind of that kind of needs to be looked at a bit more, and how you can harmonise the way that international assistance comes in to support the cluster system. Kind of got a little bit I don't know what the right word for it is, but in Vanuatu it kind of fell over a little bit. And so the idea was great, because in Vanuatu, yes, the cluster leads are governments, but it's the way in which international assistance comes to support. I think there needs to be some kind of a rethink about how that happens, or a relook at the way that happens.
Great, thank you. Now we have time for one more question. So we're going to pick up. There are several comments and questions that have come in on this theme. So I'm going to condense them all down, and I'm also noting that in the asynchronous online consultation, this was also the question that seems to have had the highest number of responses and the highest engagement among participants. The question is, well, I'm going to change the question a little bit to reflect what we're getting from our group here. What are the risks, or what are some of the risks and opportunities associated with involving more diverse humanitarian actors, particularly thinking of private sector and military assets when supporting humanitarian action in the Pacific? So both risks and opportunities. So this will be our last question round, and we'll go through again, beginning with Louise.
The biggest risk is that we don't apply the same requirements for accountability to new actors that what we currently do require of non-governmental actors. And I guess this refers to my point right at the beginning around our research into private sector engagement in the Pacific highlighted the fact that needs assessments don't tend to occur. There's really no follow-up in terms of results, issues around who's included and who's excluded. So yeah, I think it's a huge opportunity and a real positive to bring in new players. But yeah, I think how do we make sure that we don't I guess lose sight of some of those really fundamental core humanitarian principles around impartiality, that aid goes to where it's most needed, and yeah, so that would be my point.
Excellent, thanks, Louise. And Alan? Oh, sorry, just a moment, Alan. We're unmuting you. Just a moment. Okay, there you are.
Thank you. Look, this is a great question, but I'm one of those troublesome people who always questions the question. Certainly there's a lot of risks and opportunities, but we have to be very careful about characterising as humanitarian actors the military, much less the private sector. The private sector obviously has a considerable role to play, and the discussions that we've been having in the online consultation I think have been extremely productive in talking about the difference between community level economic activity, national economic activity, and of course external contributions. As far as the military is concerned, I'd be very keen to emphasise that in this function, in the provision of assistance in a humanitarian or disaster situation, the military is acting at the behest of their governments. They're not generally, and definitely should not be, operating in their primary function, which is effectively the use of violence for the end of the policy. And so what they're doing is that they're providing the significant logistic lift capacity, surge capability, and people to address a given problem. So there's a great deal that can be done there. Of course, we're very aware of the dangers of being seen to militarise aid, for want of a better phrase, and it's not a phrase that I like, because from the perspective of the military, that's generally what they're not trying to do at all. However, you do have the distorting effect when all of a sudden, particularly in the Pacific, you have the large influx of the sort of capability that many first world militaries can bring, whether it's the Australians, whether it's the New Zealanders, or certainly do not forget the Americans, who can have that vast naval presence in the Pacific and can often turn up with assistance at very short notice. So while there are enormous opportunities in terms of the response, we do need to very clearly distinguish the wholesale delivery of assistance, which should come to an end as soon as possible, from the long-term needs of Pacific communities, which are going to be better served from within their own resources and from their normal relationships with Pacific community, the normal civilian relationships with other states, and of course the provision of aid by humanitarian relief organisations which are specifically set up for this function.
Excellent. Thank you, Alan. And moving now to Simon.
Can add to what's already been said. I think risks would be a reassertion of historical power imbalances and a possible confusion of voices and the ongoing isolation of local viewpoints. But I think some of the benefits would be the scale and the ability to move the logistics that the military bring and the private sector can bring. So I think they will actually be a pretty important part moving forward. They're already an important part. One final comment on the military. The New Zealand Defence Forces are probably, after the Anglican Church, about the only bicultural institution in my country, and wherever the New Zealand military have gone around the Pacific, they're probably around 25-30% Māori. There's probably around 5 to 10% Pacific Island soldiers in our military. And there have been some lovely stories of them going into some pretty tense situations and leaving the guns on board or behind and taking in a guitar and just having the ability to sit down and be with people and to de-escalate some pretty tense situations, and that's a really valuable skill. So I think those are the sorts of positives that I would take out of that. That's what I'd have to say.
Great, thank you. And now Chris.
Again, that was a great question, and the responses so far have been terrific as well. I think that both there is a role both for the private sector and the military. So, for example, in Tonga, and I think that certainly for the private sector, it has been a sector which has sometimes felt a little bit on the outside. And in some senses not been invited in as early as it could have been. So, for example, in Tonga, we've as part of the cluster approach, but working through ministries, we've realised that a key player is, of course, the Tongan Chamber of Commerce and all the private sectors with all its members, and we've actually built that into the model because they are there. I think Simon, one of the other presenters mentioned, of course, they're there for the long term. Might have been Alan said that. So the private sector, yeah, I think they are important players, and we found that the Chamber of Commerce is the ideal sort of forum for that. But again, it would work under that ministry-led cluster. For the military, there is they do have certainly in the Pacific, most Pacific Island countries where there's a lot of water between islands, so there's huge challenges logistically, and from communications point of view, the military are geared up to provide that sort of support. And of course, we saw that in Vanuatu, where the armed forces from Australia and New Zealand and France played a really important role. And of course, in fact, also from the Solomon Islands and Tonga, they provided their patrol boats for 4 to 6 weeks as well. Some senses from the military, it's expensive for them, and often you will see them wanting to withdraw within a relatively short period of time. It's expensive keeping equipment and people there. It is obviously a sensitive area in some places, but even following the Indian Ocean tsunami in Indonesia, the Indonesian government then invited in the US naval assets from Singapore and Malaysia and Australia. I think the important thing is that they come in and then they leave within an agreed framework. They don't stay there forever. And we do see it. When Pakistan has its earthquakes and floods, they've requested and they've been provided with US helicopters. Even with all the politics behind that, they can, in certain circumstances, they can be invited in and they can do a good job, for a while and, provide some excellent service for a bit.
Great, thanks, Chris. And moving to Finau.
Hello, can you hear me?
Oh, yes, we hear you very well.
Okay, great. Yeah, the responses have been fantastic, and I'm not sure if I have actually anything different to say rather than echoing what everyone said. There's definitely a role for military and private sector in terms of humanitarian response. In addition to the countries that Chris mentioned, there was also a Fiji military medical team that was in Vanuatu, and they were able to deploy to some of the outer islands that really needed urgent medical attention. And there was the Bon Marché supermarket that donated quite a bit of rice, and I think as Chris mentioned, there is a role, and actually everyone's mentioned, there is a role for both these sectors, and I think what you need is just clear, agreed frameworks and policy that says what their role is going to be, and that just clearly articulates what that is, how long that's going to last for, and make sure that all parties are aware with it, are aware of what these are.
Great, thank you. So thank you very much to all of our panelists. It's been a very active hour and a half here, and I can see it's been great to see in the chat, in particular, there's been so much really practical exchange of examples and information resources and personal and professional contacts. So that's really excellent to see, and I hope that it can continue in one form or another. And I think one other observation I would throw in at this point is that we were speaking at a certain stage in the first part of the event about the problem of perception, understanding, awareness at the global level regarding the challenges and also simply the context of the region. But I think looking at the responses both from our panel and from our participants to the questions raised in today's events, there's clearly a lot that's being exchanged here that will be of and is, I think, already of tremendous value to other regions of the world. Some really interesting examples and good practice that are already in place. So many thanks to everyone. We are running a bit over time, for which I apologize, but we're going to go very quickly around one more time and ask each of our panelists if they have 20 or 30 seconds closing comments that they would like to offer before we wrap up the event. So going to Louise.
I'm really excited about the conversation that's going to happen in Auckland, and I'm an eternal optimist. And I think that if we can really flip the system on its head, then I think the Pacific is a good region to really try that. But I think if we are going to flip the system on its head, we need to be prepared to have a conversation about power.
Right. Thank you for that. And Alan. Sorry, Ellen, for the delay. Just one moment here. Okay, there you are.
I endorse that point. I think we really need to focus on Auckland and the opportunities that lie there. And I come back to my initial point. I think we've got a great opportunity to enhance the issue of gender in the Pacific and look to women's roles. And if there's one thing that we could take to Auckland and ultimately to Istanbul next year, it would be that issue of freeing up and ensuring that women have a voice within the Pacific and can make a far greater contribution. Because I have to say that in the area of making change, and if you look at communities that have made change, one of the most significant changes that you can make is to ensure that women are playing to their full potential.
Great, thank you. And Simon?
Yeah, kia ora, Ellen. Just want to tautoko those comments, very important. I've just noted down a couple of things here. 3 things: build on traditions, collaborate with respect, and maintain relationships.
Fantastic and very efficient. Thank you. And Chris, over to you.
Just very quickly say, look, I've enjoyed this morning and the input from different people and contributions. I think it's good to, there are obviously lots of challenges facing us, but it's good to learn the good things from each other as well. You know, sometimes to be a bit more positive. Sometimes I think we get a bit long in the tooth, long in the face. And there are lots of good things around, and we can learn from each other, and it's important to learn from each other. Yeah, that's it.
Great, thank you, Chris. And Finau, you have the last word.
Thank you. Thank you for this opportunity. It's been actually my first time using this kind of technology. And I guess I just want to say that particularly with WHS coming up and with all of the community consultations that we've been part of undertaking to feed into the WHS, it's just be encouraging that let's just no more talk fest. It's time to be real and to just be open and frank discussions around humanitarian needs. A TC5 last year, a TC5 this year. We just need to get real. There's no more time for talk. Just to work together to solve the issues and get on with it.
Thank you, Finau. I think that's the perfect ending note. So thank you very much for that. I'd like to thank once again all of our panelists for their contributions today, all of our very active participants. It's been great to chat with all of you, and we look forward to welcoming you again in a future online discussion, or hopefully meeting you in person somewhere around the world. In closing, I'd like to note regarding the recording of the event that I mentioned, that will be available at the URL you see before you on the screen. And again, that should be available in a few hours from now, after the data has gone through the processing. I'd also like to mention our next upcoming event, which is in fact tomorrow. No, sorry, not tomorrow. The day after tomorrow, Thursday, 4 June. That will be our next in the series of World Humanitarian Summits, live online consultation events hosted by us here at PHAP. This will be a cross-cutting event, so not region-specific, but looking at the global level, the issue of faith and religion in humanitarian action, and bringing together a very interesting panel. And it looks like quite a large group of participants who've expressed their interest and registered for that event on Thursday, which should be a very interesting discussion. So we would encourage everyone here, if they're interested, to read more and register at phap.org/4June 2015. So with that, again, apologies for going over time, but it can be challenging to cut an interesting discussion. Thanks again for joining us today and being part of the World Humanitarian Summit process in this special live online format. Again, for those of you who are not already actively participating in the asynchronous forum, please do visit worldhumanitariansummit.org. You can also discuss actively on Twitter with the hashtag ReshapeAid. And as for us here at PHAP, you can learn more about us at www.phap.org and also follow all of our online consultation discussions on Twitter at PHAP Forum. So with that, I'll thank my team here, intrepid team in Geneva in the middle of the night, thanking Marcus and Pedro for their fantastic assistance and hard work on all of the aspects of putting together today's events. And this is Anne Herod Lang signing off from Geneva, wishing you all well.